So I'd like to present the Crosiers to you. In some ways, this is like getting to know you, getting to know all about you. But I don't want to talk about the lengthy history of the Crosiers. I'd like to speak more directly about some of our inspiration, the sources of our inspiration, and what gives us life. So the first thing I would like to say is that there are varieties of religious orders in the church. There are varieties of congregations, and there is a great deal that makes all of us common, similar to one another. And so to look at what it is that makes us distinctive or expresses the accent of what we're all about, in some ways it's not an essential difference from one congregation or one order to another, but it gives a feel for the spirit and the inspiration and values of a particular order. So a little bit about the Crosiers. The oldest title for our order is the Fratres Sanctae Crucis. That is, the Brethren of the Holy Cross. Fratres, Brethren, Sanctae Crucis of the Holy Cross. I will talk about the Holy Cross a little later. I'd like to focus first on Fratres. The Fratres of the Brethren of the Holy Cross are an old order in the church, founded in the 13th century, 1210. And during the time of the late 12th century, there was a significant movement in the church called the Fraternal Life Movement. And from that Fraternal Life Movement, many new orders sprang into being, including the Franciscans, the Dominicans, Augustinians, Carmelites, and the Crosiers. And this Fraternal Life Movement was in some ways a distinctive understanding of being church. Prior to that Fraternal Life Movement, the church tended to be rather aristocratic, identified with the nobility, with leadership, and with the hierarchy. The Fraternal Life Movement was in some ways an attempt to reclaim, or to claim in some ways for the first time, at least at that period, to claim for ordinary people a position in the church and a primacy in the church. And the Fraternal Life Movements very strongly identified themselves not with hierarchical positions, but with fraternal positions. So for the Crosiers, to be fratres, to be the fraternal movement of the 13th century into the present, what we want to say to ourselves, for our self-identity, and to the church, is that we are brothers. And we identify our life, our religious life, with relationship to other people as brothers. This accent on being brothers is in some ways always an ideal. It is never something that we fully realize. But when we're at our best, as fratres, as brethren, we are the kind of people you'd like to have as a brother. This concentration on the Fraternal Life Movement in some ways had deeper roots than that Fraternal Life Movement of the 12th century, and is related to an attempt to go back to the earliest church, going back to the time of the apostles. So many of these groups in this Fraternal Life Movement were looking forward to a new way of being church by going back to the sources that were inspired by the scriptures. For our particular group, and at that period in the history of the church, many people went back to the Acts of the Apostles, this reading that we read right after the celebration of Easter. And the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles and the fourth chapter talk in some ways of summaries of what it was like to be Christian in those earliest years of the church. So the period of the early church, especially in Jerusalem, didn't always describe everything that took place in the church, but gave a specific accent to what it was like to be a Christian in those earliest years after Jesus' resurrection. And these are called summaries. So in the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, verse 42, there's this short summary that says, these people in Jerusalem were intent on or zealous for or dedicated to 4 things. What were they dedicated to? They were dedicated to the teaching of the apostles. They were dedicated to the breaking of the bread. They were dedicated to koinonia, or community. And they were dedicated to the prayers. What does that mean? So I will talk about this both in terms of what it meant for the apostles and what it means to us as Crosiers. We are dedicated to these 4 elements that come from the earliest church, from the Acts of the Apostles. To be dedicated to the apostolic teaching is, of course, to be dedicated to keeping the gospel of Jesus Christ alive and proclaimed. That's very strong and very fundamental to us. So the apostolic preaching of the gospel of new life, the gospel of resurrection, has always been a fundamental, significant component of our life. We're dedicated to it. The second item is the breaking of the bread, and this was the earliest church's way of talking about the Eucharist. To break bread together and to distribute it is what Jesus did all during his public ministry. And to be dedicated to the breaking of the bread was to be dedicated to that action of Jesus and the celebration of the Eucharist. So for our order, we are strongly committed to a liturgical life, particularly the Eucharist, and to a celebratory understanding of that participation in the ongoing presence, the real continuous presence of Jesus in our world. The third element is the issue of community, or, to use the Greek word koinonia. I will talk a little more about why I prefer the word koinonia. But community life is fundamental to Crosiers. It relates to this issue of being a fraternal life movement, of being a fraternal group. So to be in bonds with one another is not just an issue of good social life, a club. The fraternal life and the koinonia, the community of life, is directly related to something that occurred in the 12th century of discovering where God is in our world. God is, as St. John says, God is love. So God is found between persons, between brothers, between people who treat each other with respect and honor and joy and love. So the presence of God is that gift that occurs when people care for each other. The fourth element is the prayers, and the prayers are usually interpreted to mean the canonical prayers. The Jewish people prayed at specific times of the day, at the morning, at dawn, and in the evening at dusk, and about every 3 hours during the course of the day and also in the night. These canonical hours of prayer are called the Liturgy of the Hours. So the hours of the day are marked by turning to God and giving God honor and glory and praise. So the Crosiers have always been dedicated to the prayers, to the Liturgy of the Church, or the Liturgy of the Hours. I mentioned before that koinonia has another meaning, and I'd like to address that now. In the 4th chapter of Acts of the Apostles, Luke says that this early group of Christians had everything in common, and the word for that is koinos. They had everything in shared possession. They had common goods. This is the Crosier's understanding of the vow of poverty, or the life of poverty. And I'd like to contrast that a little bit with something that you might know from the life of St. Francis. St. Francis, the Franciscan order, was founded 1 year before the Crosier order. And as you know, St. Francis had a deep aversion to money, to wealth. He was coming from from a middle-class family where wealth was very prized and important, and Francis had a sense that this had to be avoided. So the story is that Francis had this almost disgust with even touching money. This is not the Crosier Charism. The Crosier Charism is not dualistic in the sense that material things are bad and spiritual things are good. The understanding of the vow of poverty in the Acts of the Apostles is an understanding of possessing things in common, of caring for the common good. So poverty in the early church, in the Acts of the Apostles, is always a poverty of joint ownership of common good, common possessions. So for our order, the vow of poverty is much more related to community ownership and community distribution of the goods that we hold in common for the common good, but also for ministry and for service. It's a very distinctive and contrasting understanding to what poverty was for St. Francis. I'm going to make another shift at this point to talk a little bit about the rule of Augustine. When we were founded in 1210, as part of the Canons Regular movement, the rule that was common for almost all religious orders was the rule of Saint Benedict. And many of us know something about Benedictines or Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict, in his rule, gave a way of life to people living together, but as monks, as people who were individually committed to God, to go to God in solitude, in silence, in practices of mortification and penitence. There was a sense that the way to go to God was to be deeply solitary. So the earliest monks were solitaries. They were living in solitude. The Crosiers, by contrast, following the rule of St. Augustine, had a very different way to put together the understanding of religious life. And the first words of the rule of St. Augustine are the ones I'd like to concentrate on. And let me quote them to you first in Latin, and then I will give the explanation in English. So I will sing it, because listening for a long time becomes boring. So this is the way that St. Augustine begins. Primum propter quod in unum estis congregati, ut unanimes habitetis in domo. The English? First of all, the reason you are joined together in your house is to live as one, with one mind, one heart intent on God. What's packed into this little phrase that opens up the rule of St. Augustine? He begins with primum. First of all, the major, most fundamental reason starts out by saying, first things first. This is what we're talking about. The first reason you come together in one house is not just to be bunched up or glommed together in one building, but the first reason is to become one mind, one heart, intent on God. St. Augustine found this phrase mostly in the Acts of the Apostles. Cor unum et anima una. One mind, one heart. But he always added his two special words, in Deum. We become one mind, one heart, on the way to God. This is that understanding of fraternity as discovering God in coming together, bringing together different minds, different hearts, different social experiences, different life experiences, and finding unity, creating love. So the experience of discovering unity and fraternity and community is the experience of discovering that's where God, in His spirit of love, is touching our lives. So this accent on community life and conventual life or fraternal life is deeply, deeply embedded in both the rule of St. Augustine and in the Crosier life. Very different, as a contrast, would be finding God in solitary solitude, silence, and loneliness, contrasted to finding God in community, brotherhood, and care and love for one another. The contrast is significant between those who follow the rule of Augustine, those who follow the rule of St. Benedict. St. Augustine is an important figure in the history of the Church, but for the Crosiers he's especially important because of his concentration on what is first, what comes first. And so another way of talking about the rule of St. Augustine is to say, for Augustine, before all else, love God and love your neighbor. These are the great commands. He pulled together the teachings of Jesus and put it into foundational issues for religious life. I make another shift. Again, in the earliest history of our order, the 14th century, we have the oldest book on Crosier Religious Life that comes from the 13th Master General of the Order, Petrus Pincarius. And the title of his book is significant. The title of his book is in Latin, Vestis Nuptialis. And Vestis Nuptialis, vestis means vestments or clothing, garments. Nuptialis is wedding. So the Crosier habit was called Vestis Nuptialis. Now again, I want to put that in contrast or in comparison to other religious groups. The Augustinians of the Canons Regular of St. Augustine always talked about their habit as Vestis Nuptialis, and the Crosiers did as well. In contrast, the Benedictines, the monks from the Eastern Church, and the Franciscans, the early Franciscans, always referred to their habit not as Vestis Nuptialis, but as a habit of conversion and penitence. I lived with the Franciscans in Indonesia for about 22 years, and whenever we would celebrate a feast of St. Francis, the Franciscans would remind me that they are dressed in this habit of conversion. The tone of their joining religious life was to be converted to God through penance and sorrow for their sins and a deep, deep humility for their sins and the sins of the world. That's certainly not a bad thing. So when I contrast it or when I compare it, it does not mean that I have some aversion to that understanding of religious life. But the Crosiers and Canons Regular generally talked about their habit as Vestis Nuptialis, as something that you put on when you go to a wedding feast. And this comes again from the Gospel, particularly the Gospel of Matthew, when the fellow comes into the wedding feast and he is not dressed in his wedding garment, and the host notices and says, "What are you doing here?" The Vestis Nuptialis for the Crosiers was often related to the liturgy. So participating in the liturgy, participating in the banquet of the Lamb of God, was a reason to be dressed up to go to God together. The Crosier habit, as you may have noticed, if you look at pictures of the Crosier habit, is distinctive. I live in Rome, and whenever I participate in events in Rome, or when Crosiers participate in Rome, all the cameras from all these papal television stations hunt us out and try to find out who are these people and get a good snapshot. If you look at the Crosier habit, it's a beautiful habit. It's a piece of art. It is a work of art. The lines are clean, black and white, a very strong contrast, of course. But then especially for our younger members, when they're wearing the habit, they look good in this wedding garment. But I'd like to draw your attention particularly to the red and white cross on the center of our breasts, our chests, our thorax. The red and white cross comes from the earliest part of the church. And here we come now back to that first question I said, the fratres sanctae crucis. We've looked at the fraternal life. What is this fraternity of the Holy Cross? The Holy Cross for Crosiers is the cross that we celebrate on the feast of the Exaltation of the Cross. The major feast of the Crosiers is the 14th of September. And the readings from that feast day are from the Gospel of John and from the book of Numbers, the story about Moses lifting up the serpent in the desert, and from the book of St. Paul's letter to the Philippians. The cross for the Crosiers is always called the glorious cross. If you look at the Crosier cross, there's not a corpus on the Crosier cross. The oldest crosses in the church did not have the corpus. Particularly St. Francis made that corpus attached to the cross a centerpiece, and in some ways the cross ever since then seems to be, and many people say, the Catholic cross is the one with the corpus, the Protestant cross is the one without the corpus. That's not exactly a fair distinction for the history of the church. The Crosiers have the cross without the corpus, and it's the glorious cross. In the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, the words that stand out are the lifting up of the cross, the lifting it up on high in glory to God. Because the cross is not primarily seen from the human point of view as an instrument of torture and the place where Jesus died. The cross is seen as God revealing what God is like for all of humankind. In some ways, then, it is not from the point of view of Calvary and from the point of view of the historical Jesus being crucified and condemned to death and killed by Pilate. It is seen from the point of view of God's eternal plan to show forth how much God's love for the world is. So on the Feast of the Exaltation, we have this phrase from the Gospel of John, which says, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son so that we might live. The measure of God's love, how much does God love us? So large is God's love that he gives himself to death, to annihilation, to not being, so that we would be saved. This is a strong, strong accent in the Crosier's spirituality of the cross, and it is also the spirituality that we pick from the earliest church, from the teachings of St. Paul and the Gospel of St. John. It's wonderful to be a Crosier, to be a member of that fraternal life dedicated to the glorious cross. We proclaim it. We try to keep the gospel of Christ alive and proclaimed by our lives and by our proclamation.